Two nations are racing to plant boots on the same patch of lunar dust, and only one of them is telling the truth about how far behind they really are. For decades, the idea of a space race felt like a relic of the Cold War, something that belonged to grainy black and white footage of Apollo astronauts bouncing across gray plains while the Soviet Union watched from the sidelines. But right now, in this very decade, two of the most powerful nations on Earth are once again pouring billions of dollars, some of their best engineering minds, and enormous amounts of national pride into a competition to return humans to the moon. On one side is the United States, through NASA and a growing constellation of private companies. On the other side is China, through the China National Space Administration and its increasingly confident human spaceflight program. And the honest answer to who is winning is far more complicated and far more interesting than either government's press releases would have you believe. To understand where we are today, it helps to remember where this all started. The original space race of the 1950s and 60s was a two-horse contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, driven almost entirely by Cold War fear and prestige. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, it was widely seen as the decisive victory in that race. And for the next 50 years, human beings did not walk on another world again. The space shuttle era that followed was extraordinary in its own right, but it kept humans confined to low Earth orbit, building space stations and launching satellites rather than pushing further into deep space. China was not even a serious player in human spaceflight until the 21st century, when it quietly began building the foundations of a program that would eventually challenge American dominance in space. That foundation was called Project 921, approved by the Chinese government back in 1992, decades before most people outside the aerospace industry were paying attention. Fast forward to today, and the picture looks completely different. NASA's return to the moon is built around a program called Artemis, named after the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology, a fitting choice for a program designed to pick up where the original moon missions left off. Artemis rests on three central pillars. The first is the Space Launch System, a massive rocket that stands taller than the Statue of Liberty and is currently one of the most powerful launch vehicles ever built. The second is the Orion spacecraft, the capsule designed to carry astronauts safely to the moon and back, complete with a European-built service module that provides power and propulsion. The third and most complicated piece is the Human Landing System, the actual vehicle that will carry astronauts down to the lunar surface and back up again, since Orion itself is not designed to land. Artemis has already produced real, tangible results. Artemis 1 flew all the way back in November of 2022, sending an uncrewed Orion capsule on a journey of more than 2 million kilometers around the moon and back to Earth, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean exactly 50 years to the day after the final Apollo moon landing. That mission proved the hardware could survive the trip. Then, in April of 2026, Artemis 2 carried a crew of 4 astronauts on a 10-day journey around the moon and back, marking the first time humans had traveled beyond low Earth orbit since the Apollo era more than 50 years earlier. It was, by every measure, a major milestone, and it proved that the Space Launch System and Orion could safely carry a human crew on a deep space trajectory. But here is where the story gets more complicated, and where a lot of the public conversation about this race tends to get confused. In February of 2026, NASA made a significant announcement that reshaped the entire Artemis timeline. Instead of using the next mission, Artemis 3, to actually land astronauts on the lunar surface as originally planned, NASA restructured the mission into a test flight that will remain in Earth orbit. The goal of this revised Artemis 3 is to practice rendezvous and docking with the commercial landers being built by SpaceX and Blue Origin, essentially de-risking the mission before attempting an actual landing. The real crewed lunar landing has now been pushed to Artemis 4, currently targeted for early 2028, with a second landing mission, Artemis 5, expected later that same year. NASA's stated reasoning is that the landers themselves, both SpaceX's Starship-based system and Blue Origin's Blue Moon, are simply not ready yet, and that flying a test mission first is safer than rushing a landing attempt. This is not a small detail. It reveals one of the core challenges facing the American side of this race. The human landing system depends on private companies solving extraordinarily difficult engineering problems that have never been attempted at this scale before. SpaceX's Starship, for example, needs to perform repeated in-orbit refueling, transferring massive amounts of cryogenic propellant from one Starship vehicle to another while in space, something that has never been done before in human spaceflight history. As of early 2026, that critical capability had still not been demonstrated, and the newest version of Starship had not even completed its first test flight. Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander has made progress of its own, successfully completing vacuum chamber testing on an early cargo-focused version, but a fully human-rated crewed lander is still under development as well. NASA's own internal watchdog, the Office of Inspector General, has publicly raised concerns that both landers face schedule delays and technical risks that could push the 2028 landing target even further into the future. At the same time, NASA has been making bigger structural changes to keep the program moving forward. The agency announced it is pausing development of the Lunar Gateway, a small space station that was originally intended to orbit the Moon and serve as a waypoint between Orion and the landers. Instead, resources are being redirected toward building infrastructure directly on the lunar surface, aiming to establish the first elements of a permanent moon base by around 2030. NASA has also emphasized increasing the pace of missions, aiming for annual crewed landings once Artemis 4 succeeds, and is asking its commercial partners to accelerate development wherever possible. This is a program in the middle of significant transformation, trying to balance political pressure for faster results with the genuine engineering difficulty of returning humans to another world. Now let's turn to the other side of this competition. Because China's program tells a very different story, one defined less by dramatic course corrections and more by steady, incremental progress toward a long-standing goal. China's human lunar ambitions are built around an integrated architecture that combines a new crew capsule called Mengzhu, a dedicated lunar lander called Lanyu, and a powerful new rocket called the Long March 10. Unlike NASA's approach of hiring commercial companies to build separate landers, China's program is almost entirely state-directed, developed and executed by the China Manned Space Agency and its supporting state-owned aerospace contractors. China's roadmap has been remarkably consistent for years. Its plan involves two separate Long March 10 rocket launches for each crewed lunar mission, one carrying the Mengzhu capsule with the astronauts, and the other carrying the Lanyu lander, which then rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit before two astronauts transfer down to the surface. Chinese officials have repeatedly and publicly stated that the country intends to land astronauts on the Moon before 2030, and unlike NASA's shifting mission structure, China's messaging on this timeline has stayed remarkably stable. Testing has already been underway on several fronts. The Long March 10 rocket has completed low-altitude demonstration flights. The Mengzhu spacecraft has undergone maximum dynamic pressure escape and abort tests, and both systems are expected to fly their first uncrewed test missions in the near future, paving the way toward an eventual joint crewed test mission before the actual landing attempt. What makes China's approach particularly interesting is how deliberately it builds on existing infrastructure rather than starting from scratch. China's Tiangong space station, which has been continuously crewed since it became operational, plays a quiet but important role in preparing for the Moon. Chinese officials have explicitly stated that the space station helps train experienced astronauts, tests key technologies in orbit, and improves the reliability of systems like the Mengzhu spacecraft that will eventually be used for lunar missions. In other words, Every Tiangong mission doubles as a rehearsal for the moon, giving China a growing pool of experienced astronauts and a track record of operational reliability that it can draw on as it moves toward a crewed lunar landing. China's robotic lunar exploration program, known as Chang, deserves its own spotlight here because it has quietly become one of the most successful planetary exploration efforts of the 21st century. Chang missions have delivered an unbroken string of successes. Chang 4 achieved the first ever soft landing on the far side of the moon, a genuinely unprecedented feat given the communication challenges involved. Chang 5 returned lunar samples to Earth for the first time since the 1970s. Chang 6 went even further, retrieving the first ever samples from the moon's far side, something no other nation has ever accomplished. Now, Chang 7 is scheduled to launch in the second half of 2026, targeting the lunar South Pole to search for water ice using an orbiter, a lander, and a small hopping probe, all in the same mission. Chang 8 is expected to follow in 2028, testing technologies for using lunar resources directly on the surface, effectively laying the groundwork for a permanent lunar base. This is where the true nature of the competition becomes clear, because both nations are converging on the exact same destination for very practical reasons. The lunar South Pole is believed to contain significant deposits of water ice trapped permanently in shadowed craters, ice that could theoretically be converted into drinking water, breathable oxygen, and rocket fuel for future missions deeper into space. NASA's Artemis program has long targeted the South Pole for its eventual landing sites, and China's Chang 7 and Chang 8 missions are explicitly designed to scout the exact same region. Neither country is hiding this overlap. It means that the coming years could see American and Chinese hardware operating within relatively close proximity of one another on the lunar surface, something that raises fascinating questions about coordination, competition, and potentially conflict over the most valuable real estate near the moon's South Pole. Beyond the hardware and the mission timelines, there is a deeper philosophical difference between how these two nations are running their space programs, and that difference might matter more than any single technical milestone. NASA's approach under recent budget priorities has leaned heavily into commercial partnerships, hearing private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin to build critical hardware under fixed-price contracts, with the idea that competition and market incentives will drive down costs and speed up innovation. This approach has produced genuine breakthroughs, particularly through SpaceX's reusable rocket technology, but it has also introduced real uncertainty, since NASA's own timeline now depends heavily on the pace at which private companies can solve extremely hard engineering problems like orbital refueling. China, by contrast, runs its program through a centralized state structure, where the government sets the timeline and directs its aerospace contractors to meet it, without needing to negotiate with independent companies pursuing their own separate business interests. This gives China's program a level of predictability and message discipline that NASA's more decentralized commercial model simply does not have, even if it may lack some of the raw, innovative energy that private competition can provide. Money tells an important part of this story too. NASA's overall budget dwarfs China's publicly acknowledged space spending by a significant margin, and the Artemis program alone has already cost tens of billions of dollars, with NASA's own leadership stating that establishing just the initial elements of a lunar base could cost another $20 billion over the next several years. China's government does not publish detailed space budgets the way the United States does, which makes direct comparisons difficult, but independent analysts estimate that China's entire Chang program, spanning nearly 2 decades, has cost only a small fraction of what the United States has spent on Artemis alone. This raises a genuinely important question for anyone following this competition closely. Is NASA's much larger spending buying it a meaningfully faster or more capable program, Or is China achieving comparable milestones through leaner, more disciplined execution? The state of each country's space station program adds another layer to this comparison, and it might end up being one of the most consequential differences of all. The International Space Station, the extraordinary orbital laboratory built through cooperation between the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada, is approaching the end of its operational life, with retirement currently expected sometime between 2030 and 2032. China's Tiangong space station, meanwhile, has no announced retirement date and continues to host regular crewed missions, with China actively inviting international partners to conduct experiments and even train astronauts aboard it. If the International Space Station retires before a like-for-like American successor is ready to fly, there is a real possibility that Tiangong could become the only continuously operating space station in low Earth orbit for a period of time, a symbolically powerful shift in who controls humanity's foothold in space, even temporarily. International partnerships reveal a similar split in strategy. The United States has built its coalition through the Artemis Accords, a set of principles signed by dozens of countries committing to peaceful and transparent lunar exploration under an American-led framework. China has pursued a parallel strategy through its International Lunar Research Station initiative, partnering with Russia and recruiting a growing list of other nations, including recent training agreements with countries like Pakistan, whose astronauts are set to fly aboard Tiangong as part of the broader partnership. In effect, two competing international coalitions are forming around two different visions of how humanity should return to the moon, and the nations that choose to align with one camp or the other are making a statement not just about space policy, but about broader geopolitical alignment. So who is actually winning, based on everything happening in 2026? If you judge purely on flown hardware and completed missions, NASA currently holds a real lead. American astronauts have already flown around the moon aboard Orion, something China has not yet done with its Mengzhe spacecraft in a crewed configuration. If you judge based on schedule discipline and the steady accumulation of successful missions without dramatic course corrections, China currently looks stronger, having avoided the kind of major public restructuring that NASA was forced to announce for Artemis 3. If you judge based on the ambitious goal of actually landing humans back on the lunar surface, both nations are now targeting remarkably similar windows, NASA aiming for early 2028 with Artemis 4, and China aiming for sometime before 2030, meaning the gap between them could realistically come down to a matter of months or a couple of years rather than an entire generation, as it was during the original Cold War race. Perhaps the most honest answer is that this race no longer looks like the winner-take-all sprint of the 1960s. Both countries appear to be building lasting, sustainable capabilities rather than racing simply to plant a flag and leave. NASA is trying to build permanent infrastructure on the lunar surface alongside a thriving commercial space economy back on Earth. China is trying to build an integrated pipeline from space station experience to robotic scouting to eventual human landings, with a long-term vision extending all the way to a full lunar research station by the mid-2030s. Both approaches carry real risks. NASA's commercial landers remain unproven at the exact scale required for a moon landing, while China's crewed lunar hardware has yet to complete a single uncrewed flight test, let alone carry astronauts. Anyone confidently predicting which nation will land humans back on the moon first is making an educated guess dressed up as certainty, because both programs are still navigating genuine, unresolved technical hurdles. What is completely certain, though, is that the era of a single nation dominating human space exploration without serious competition is over. Whether you are rooting for NASA's commercially powered ambition or China's methodical state-driven persistence, the simple fact that two major powers are now racing seriously toward the same lunar South Pole, chasing the same water ice, building toward the same long-term dream of a permanent human presence beyond Earth, is itself one of the most remarkable developments in the entire history of space exploration. The next few years, likely between 2027 and 2030, will finally settle which nation gets there first. But if history has taught us anything from the original space race, sometimes the competition itself accelerates progress for everyone involved, pushing both nations, and ultimately all of humanity, further into the solar system than either one could have managed alone.